The last of the daylight was sinking behind the rooftops when I turned into my father's neighborhood, the kind of dusk that makes familiar streets look like places you've never been. My truck rolled through the quiet, its headlights sweeping over cracked sidewalks and porches where no one sat anymore. The air had that brittle, early evening chill that slips under a man's collar long before he notices it. Something felt off. Not dramatic, not loud, just a disturbance in the usual rhythm of the block, like a note held too long in an old song. I couldn't explain it, but the road ahead carried a tension I could feel in my hands on the steering wheel. Then between the thinning trees and the row of small houses, a sharp reflection cut through the dim, clean polish too bright for this part of town. It flashed once, then steadied into a gleam that didn't belong anywhere near my father's life. Not with his failing memory, not with the way he counted every dollar like it had a heartbeat. I slowed. The truck's engine hummed low as if it understood before I did. Every instinct told me the shine ahead wasn't just a car catching the last bit of daylight. It was something else, a sign, a boundary crossed by someone who thought no one would notice. I eased deeper into the street, letting the silence close in around me. By the time I reached the mouth of the block, I already knew the evening was steering me towards something I wasn't prepared to see, and that was the moment everything began to shift. I pulled into my father's street just as the last light slipped behind the houses. Everything looked the same as it always had, quiet and a little worn. The kind of neighborhood that held on to its memories longer than the people who lived in it. My truck gave its usual rattle when I shut the engine off, the sound echoing through the stillness. I was tired from work, tired in the way a man gets after years of doing the same honest labor. But I told myself I would check on Dad before heading home. It felt like the kind of responsibility you carry without thinking. What I saw in the driveway stopped me where I stood. A brand new SUV sat there, polished and shining like a misplaced luxury in the fading light. Midnight blue, spotless, so clean I could see the reflection of the bare winter trees on its surface. Dad had never owned anything like that. He had spent his life on the road in 18-wheelers, preferred old trucks with dents that told stories. Seeing a car like that in front of his house felt like seeing a stranger on your family's porch. I closed the door of my truck, letting the cold air steady my thoughts. The wind carried the faint smell of chimney smoke. For a moment I just looked at the SUV, trying to place it in a life where it did not belong. My father's porch light flickered behind the screen door, a soft reminder of the home I grew up in. Everything familiar and one thing completely out of place. The door opened and Kelly stepped out with easy confidence. She held a set of keys as if they belonged to her, the metal catching the last bit of daylight. She smiled, warm on the surface, yet carefully arranged the kind of smile people practice when they want to be liked before they need to be trusted. She said she hoped I was doing well. Her voice had a softness that felt designed for my father, but not for me. Dad appeared behind her, leaning on the frame like a man unsure of his own strength. His eyes brightened when he saw me, but then hesitation flickered in them. Recognition struggled with confusion, and for a second I saw the man he had been and the man he was becoming, both trying to speak at once. He told me he was glad I was there and thanked me for helping Kelly buy the new car. His words hung in the air like dust caught in a beam of light. Kelly watched me closely, waiting for how I would react. I did not give her anything. I asked Dad what he meant. He repeated that Kelly said I had helped with the purchase. His voice carried trust, the old kind, the kind that comes from years of believing the world still made sense. His hand rested lightly on her arm as though she were an anchor. That small gesture hurt more than the lie itself. Mark arrived a minute later, stepping out of his truck with that rushed energy he always carried when he wanted to control the story before anyone else could. Before I got out a word, he told me not to make a scene. He said Kelly had done more for Dad than the rest of us combined. His tone was sharp, defensive, layered with the old resentment we never dealt with since the day our mother's will was read. The kind of resentment that settles between brothers like dust on an unused shelf. Inside the house, Laura waited in the living room. She greeted me with a quiet look, something between concern and resignation. She had always been the one who saw both sides, the one who kept the peace even when the rest of us pulled in different directions. When her eyes met mine, I could tell she had been watching this situation longer than anyone else. We sat for dinner. Kelly moved through the kitchen as if she owned the space. She made Dad's plate first. She reminded him gently about his medication, guiding him through simple choices, answering questions he had not fully asked. When I tried to speak with him, she stepped in with soft explanations. If he hesitated, she smoothed the edges of the silence before he could gather his thoughts. It was subtle, too subtle, the way a person takes over without looking like they are taking anything at all. Dad looked tired. His hands trembled when he picked up his fork. I remembered those same hands teaching me how to change oil in an old Ford pickup when I was 12, grease under his nails, country music on the radio, his voice telling me that every man should know how to take care of what he relies on. Seeing those hands so unsure now scraped at something deep inside me. After dinner, I stepped outside into the cold. The sky had turned the color of old steel. The neighborhood was quiet except for a distant dog barking. I walked toward the SUV, studying the temporary plate taped onto the back. The tape was uneven, the edges creased. Not the work of a dealership, more like the work of someone who needed something to look official in a hurry. I ran my hand along the cold metal of the door. The car felt out of place, like an object from someone else's life, dropped into ours without warning. Through the window, I could see the faint outline of the living room, my father moving slowly toward his recliner. Kelly followed him with that same quiet control, a presence too steady to be comforting. A light snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting across the driveway. I stood there, letting the cold settle deeper. There was a heaviness in the air, not loud, not dramatic, just a weight that told me something was unfolding behind the scenes. And I had been too tired or too trusting to see it. I remembered a moment from years ago, a truck stop somewhere in Indiana. Dad had bought me a slice of pie and told me that life would test a man in ways he never expected. Sometimes through hardship, sometimes through people. He said you learn who you are by what you do when the road turns dark. I had not thought about that moment in a long time, but it came back to me now, as clear as if he were repeating it beside me. I looked at the SUV one last time. The snow gathered on the windshield. The cold metal under my hand felt like a quiet warning. Something was wrong. Something had already begun. And if Kelly had used his money to buy herself this new life, then every dollar had left a mark, a trail, one that I would follow. I turned back toward the house, the porch light casting a soft glow on the old wooden steps. I could see Dad through the window. He looked small in his chair, smaller than the man who once held up our entire family with long hauls and long nights on the road. I stayed there in the cold a little longer, letting the silence settle, letting the truth take shape. Then I stepped inside. The door closed softly behind me. The night remained heavy, but I carried a new sense of purpose with it. Something quiet and steady. Something that told me this was only the beginning. Morning settled over the neighborhood in a pale wash when I stepped outside. The air held the quiet bite of early winter, and a thin layer of snow clung to the driveway like a memory that had not melted yet. I walked to my truck, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders from a night of broken sleep. The house behind me was still, its windows dim, but something in that silence felt unsettled. As I drove home, the sun rose slowly behind the bare trees and the road stretched out in a long gray line that gave me too much time to think. Inside my kitchen, the familiar things waited for me. The chipped mug by the sink, the old clock above the stove, the soft hum of the refrigerator. I set my keys on the table and pulled out the folder I had taken from Dad's drawer. His name was printed across the top of each bank statement, steady as ever, but the numbers told another story. The withdrawals were small, almost humble in amount, yet too frequent and too regular. The dates formed a strange rhythm. It was the kind of pattern you notice only when you know how a man lives and how he doesn't. Dad had never used an ATM, not once. I remembered being a kid standing beside him at the bank counter while he talked with the tellers. He liked seeing where his money went. He liked clarity. That memory pressed against the sight of the withdrawals like two mismatched puzzle pieces. I felt a heaviness rise inside me, slow but sure. I drove back to his house just before noon. The sky hung low and colorless. Kelly answered the door almost before my hand touched it. Her smile was bright and even, but her eyes stayed sharp. She asked if I had come to check on Dad and said he had slept late. Her tone was smooth, practiced, carrying the soft warmth she used around him. I held the folder against my side. I asked her about the withdrawals. She paused only a moment before saying they were for household errands. Small things Dad liked to keep in cash. Her voice stayed light, but something behind her words felt tight. I watched her change her stance, shifting her weight in a way that suggested she wanted the conversation over before it began. I thanked her and stepped past her into the house. Dad sat in his recliner with a blanket over his knees. His face brightened when he saw me. The quiet happiness in his eyes made something tighten in my chest. I asked him about the errands and he frowned lightly as if searching for a memory far away. He lifted his hand as though the right answer was floating somewhere above him. Then he said Kelly handled it. His voice was faint, almost apologetic. That small sound felt like a piece of him slipping out of reach. A moment later, he coughed, a dry sound that made me move closer. I helped him lift the mug, steadying his hand. The steam curled upward, and I caught a faint glimpse of our old life in that moment. Dad sitting in the cab of his truck with a thermos of coffee between us. The radio humming a country song he liked. His laugh filling the space. The memory flickered and faded. Mark arrived not long after. He stepped inside quickly, glancing at the folder in my hand. His shoulders tightened. He said I was being ridiculous. He said there was no need to dig into Dad's finances and that Kelly had it under control. His tone was sharp, but behind it I heard something he was trying to hide, a tremor of worry or guilt. He didn't look at Dad when he said it. He kept his eyes on me, daring me to argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction. When he left the room to answer a call, Laura came closer. She kept her voice low. She said she had once seen Dad hand Kelly a sealed envelope of cash. She said Dad told her he wanted to feel helpful again. Her eyes softened when she said it, carrying a sunness that sat deep in her expression. She squeezed my arm just once before stepping back. That small touch told me more than any confession. Later that afternoon, I opened the doorbell camera feed on my phone. I watched the clips play out in the soft glow of the living room. The porch appeared under different hours of the night. Kelly stepped into the frame more than once long after her shift ended. Her steps were measured. Her eyes scanned the street before she unlocked the door. She carried herself like someone checking borders, not caring for an old man. I rewound each clip slowly. The more I watched, the more I saw the confidence in her posture. It wasn't the confidence of a caregiver. It was something else. The living room around me felt heavy with memory. Mom's knitting basket sat beside the couch. The pictures from Dad's trucking days lined the wall in their old frames. I ran my hand along one of them, the glass cool under my fingers. Dad stood beside his first truck in that photo, broad-shouldered and proud. Seeing that version of him while the man I had spoken to earlier struggled to remember details made my chest tighten. I went to his desk and opened his laptop. The light from the screen cast a faint glow across the room. His email showed several recent logins. One of them came from an address I didn't recognize. I looked it up. A motel 30 miles away, the kind of place that lived in the shadow of a highway, the kind of place where people drifted in and out without wanting to be seen. A cold clarity settled over me then. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was slow, like the way dawn replaces night without asking permission. If Kelly was touching his accounts, she wasn't doing it alone. Someone else was behind her, someone who stayed out of sight and let her soften the ground. I sat there for a long time, hands resting on my knees. The house was quiet except for the heater's soft hum and the faint sound of Dad shifting in the next room. For a moment I stayed completely still, letting the truth find its way through the noise in my mind. I stood and walked toward the hallway. As I passed Dad's door, I heard him cough again, a small, tired sound. I paused without thinking. A sliver of warm light stretched across the floor from the crack in his door. On his nightstand, I saw the old pocket knife he used to carry on the road, the one with the worn wooden handle. Its blade was closed, its surface dull, but something about seeing it there made me stop. He had carried that knife for decades, always ready to fix something that had come loose. Now it sat untouched, a reminder of what time had taken. I reached down and picked it up, turning it gently in my hand. The wood felt smooth from years of use. I placed it back exactly where it had been, but the weight of it stayed with me. The house breathed around me, old and familiar, holding a silence that felt different now. I stood in the hallway until the light shifted and the moment passed. Then I stepped back into the living room and let the curtain fall closed behind me. The day was fading, but something in me had already changed. The shadows in the numbers were no longer shadows. They were the beginning of a path I knew I had to follow. The hallway felt darker when I stepped away from Dad's room. The house held that late afternoon stillness when the light loses its warmth, and the shadows begin to pull long fingers across the floor. I moved through it quietly, the sound of my boots softened by the old carpet. Something inside me had shifted into place, steady and undeniable. I walked toward the front door, opened it, and let the cold air settle on my skin before heading to the truck. At the bank, the day was in full motion. Customers lined up, voices, low coats still dusted with snow. I stood near the window while a senior teller reviewed the papers I laid out. She took her time, her brow tightening as she scanned each line of transactions. The hum of printers and distant conversations washed around us, but my attention stayed fixed on her hands moving across the pages. She said the withdrawals did not match the profile of an elder account. Her voice dipped slightly as she explained she could flag the activity. She added that adult protective services might be notified. The moment of caution came after that. Without Dad's direct consent, she said delays were likely. She looked at me as though she wanted to say more, but chose not to. I thanked her, gathered the papers, and stepped back into the cold. I sat in the truck for a moment with the heater blowing warm air across my hands. I knew what the teller meant without her having to spell it out. In situations like this, proof had to be more than suspicion or instinct. It had to be sharp, clear, impossible to deny. The kind of proof you find when you go looking in places you would rather not visit. The motel stood near the edge of the county line, a long building with faded paint and a sign that flickered even in daylight. The gravel lot crunched under my boots as I walked to the office. A bell jingled when I pushed the door open. The manager looked up from behind the counter. His eyes moved from my jacket to the papers in my hand. Reading more than I said, I told him I was looking for information about someone who might have stayed there. He listened without interrupting. When I mentioned Kelly's name, he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into cautious recognition. He said she had stayed there a few nights off and on. A tall man visited her often, a man with a rough voice who never gave his name. The manager spoke quietly, weighing his words. When he added the name Derek, something inside me tightened. It felt like hearing a piece of a puzzle fall into place whether you wanted it to or not. I thanked him and stepped outside. The wind coming off the highway carried the smell of exhaust and something colder. I looked across the parking lot, imagining Kelly meeting this man under the weak glow of the streetlights, handing over envelopes, listening to instructions she could not refuse. The image settled like frost under my ribs. On the drive home, I replayed every moment from the past weeks. Dad apologizing for forgetting things he never forgot. His hands hesitating when he reached for his wallet. The tremor in his voice when he said he hoped he was not a burden. All the signs I had convinced myself were part of aging now pointed in another direction. Someone had shaped those feelings, guided them, twisted them into something they could exploit. By the time I reached Dad's house, early evening had set in. Kelly's car was not in the driveway, but the porch light glowed as if waiting. I stepped inside and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table. He was staring at a folded piece of mail, turning it over like a puzzle he could not solve. When he looked up, his eyes softened. He asked if everything was all right. His voice carried a hint of worry that struck me harder than anything else. I told him he did not need to worry about anything today. He nodded, folding the mail again, but his hands were shaking. I placed a hand on his shoulder and felt the thinness of the moment, the fragile space where trust used to live. He said quietly that he hoped he had not done something wrong. His voice was almost a whisper. The words twisted in me, sharp and unexpected. I wanted to tell him the truth, that none of this was his fault, but the moment slipped before I could speak. He turned his attention back to the paper in front of him, and the chance passed. I stepped into the living room where the late sun filtered through the curtains. The light caught the dust in the air, making it shimmer. I took out the receipts I had collected, the bank prints, the notes from the camera timestamps. I spread them across the table, arranging them carefully the way Dad used to lay out his tools before fixing something important. Each piece held a part of the story, and together they began to reveal the shape of what had been hidden. When everything was in front of me, I sat down and opened my laptop. The screen lit the room in a cool glow. I entered the name I had heard at the motel, Derek Summers. The results filled the screen piece by piece. Mentions in small local reports, investigations that went nowhere, multi-state fraud inquiries, patterns of disappearing just before charges were filed, a trail of seniors whose trust had been bent until it broke. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. The room grew quiet around me. Outside, the last of the sun slipped behind the trees. I let the darkness come in slowly, the glow of the screen, the only light left. Somewhere in the house, Dad coughed, the sound faint and tired. I closed the laptop gently. The truth was clearer now, not fully formed, but standing in front of me like a shadow taking shape. I rose from the table and walked to the window. The yard lay still under the changing light. The branches of the maple tree reached across the sky like long arms stretched thin. I rested my hand against the cold glass and let the silence hold me there, suspended between what I had learned and what I knew was coming next. The moment stayed with me, quiet and heavy, before the night finally settled into the room. The night had settled thick around the house, the kind of darkness that softens every sound. I stood by the window a moment longer, feeling the cold from the glass seep into my hand. The pieces on the table behind me waited in a silent line, each one a reminder of what I had learned and what I could no longer ignore. I gathered them slowly, slid them back into the folder, and took a long breath that felt heavier than the room itself. Then I stepped outside and drove toward town, letting the engine warm against the cold. Sam Klein's office sat in a small brick building near the courthouse, its windows lit even at that hour. I pushed the door open and the soft ring of a bell drifted through the quiet room. Sam looked up from behind his desk, his glasses low on his nose, the lines around his eyes pulled tight from years of listening to stories most people would rather not hear. He gestured for me to sit. I laid the folder in front of him, the papers fanning out slightly as if eager to reveal themselves. He read through everything slowly. The only sound in the room was the steady click of his pen against the edge of his desk, and the hum of a heater working hard against the cold. With each page he turned, the air grew more weighted. When he finally leaned back, he let out a long breath that told me more than any words could. He said the name Derek Summers with a gravity that made my hands tighten. He explained that Derek had been noted in investigations across 3 states, always linked to caregivers who suddenly lived beyond their means. Sam spoke without raising his voice. He described men and women who had been coerced into forging signatures, draining accounts, reshaping the emotional world of the elderly under the guise of care. He said these were not random crimes, they were engineered relationships built on loneliness, guilt, and routine dependency. I felt a cold pressure settle beneath my ribs. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that reading it on a screen had not. Sam leaned forward, his voice quieter now. He said my father was not just dealing with a manipulative caregiver. He had stepped into the reach of something larger, something practiced. He told me to keep collecting evidence, to stay calm, to avoid confrontations that could complicate what needed to be done. He said he would speak with someone in the state prosecutor's office. He warned me that this was not simply theft, it was a pattern, a structure, an operation designed to disappear once it had taken everything it needed. I nodded through the weight of it all, pressed harder than I expected. I gathered the papers and stood. Sam walked me to the door, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a gesture meant to steady more than encourage. Outside, the late afternoon had dipped into early evening. The lights from the street lamps glowed faintly through the rising fog. I stood there a moment, letting the cool air settle my mind. When I returned to Dad's house, the place smelled faintly of rosemary and warm butter. Kelly stood at the stove stirring something in a pan. She turned with a smile that felt too smooth. Dad sat at the table watching her as if she were the only steady thing in the room. He looked up at me and smiled, but behind his eyes I saw a flicker of confusion trying to hold itself together. Kelly asked how my day had been. Her voice was soft, but the way she watched my reaction carried a sharpness I could feel. She moved around the kitchen with confidence, adjusting the pot, touching Dad's shoulder, humming a tune under her breath. If I had not known what I knew, I might have believed she was simply devoted. But now every gesture felt deliberate, placed with purpose, smoothing over the cracks in a world she wanted to control. Mark arrived soon after, the door closing hard behind him. He dropped his jacket on the chair and walked in with the restless energy of a man whose own life was slipping beyond his grip. He asked if I had been bothering Kelly again. His tone carried the irritation he used when fear hid beneath the surface. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on the meal she prepared. I saw the way he relaxed when she smiled at him, the relief in his expression, the gratitude he did not want anyone else to see. Laura came in later. She stood beside me quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She leaned in and whispered that we needed to stay calm, that Dad could not handle another argument. She admitted she felt the same dread I did, though she tried to keep it from showing. The tremor in her voice told me she was carrying her own fears tucked deep to keep the peace. I stepped outside for a moment to clear my head. The night had settled heavier now, the sky dimming into a deep blue. The porch light cast a narrow path across the driveway. The SUV gleamed under it, silent and polished, a symbol of how much had already been taken. I walked toward it, stopping close enough to see my own reflection on the door. The cold metal held no answer. Only the truth that something had been set in motion long before I noticed the first scenes. Back inside, I gathered the receipts, the camera clips, the notes I had taken. Everything I could hold on to as proof. I laid them out on the coffee table one by one. They formed a line across the surface, each piece steady and undeniable. I noticed how my hands moved with the same precision Dad once used, fixing engines, every wrench and bolt laid out before he began the work. It felt like preparing for a repair, although this one reached far deeper than any machine. I opened my laptop and typed Derek's full name into the database again, letting the screen fill with lines of reports and unfinished cases. The light from the screen cast a pale glow across the room. The truth was no longer scattered across separate moments. It had formed a full shape now, sharp enough to cut. I closed the laptop and leaned back, feeling the weight settle in my chest. The house around me was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was the kind that waits patient and heavy, the kind that arrives before a storm. In the next room, Dad's voice drifted faintly soft and tired, asking Kelly something I could not hear. She answered with a calm assurance, her tone gentle, wrapping around him like a practiced comfort. I watched their shadows move across the hallway wall, two figures caught in a script he no longer understood. I stayed there, listening to their voices fade into the soft hum of the house. Then I looked at the folder on the table, its edges worn from being carried too many times. The truth inside it felt larger than the room itself. The SUV in the driveway had only been the beginning. The night after leaving Sam's office stayed with me like a weight pressed against my chest. I carried it back to Dad's house the next morning, arriving before the sun had fully risen. The yard was still damp with dew, and the porch steps creaked under my boots the way they always had. Inside, the house felt warmer than usual, almost stifling, as if someone had turned up the heat a little too high. Kelly stood in the hallway holding a laundry basket and told me Dad was resting. Her voice was soft, steady, but her eyes lingered on me longer than they needed to. I told her I would wait with him. She hesitated, shifting the basket from one hip to the other before saying he had been tired and needed a few more hours. The way she said it did not sound like a suggestion. I nodded and stepped into the living room anyway. Dad's door clicked shut behind me, and I felt the message in that quiet sound. Access was no longer assumed, it was controlled. I took a few days off work, telling my supervisor there were family matters I needed to handle. He offered sympathy in the stiff way men do when they do not know the details. When I returned to the house each morning, Kelly had already arranged the day. Breakfast ready, medications sorted, schedules printed and placed neatly on the counter. Each time I stepped into the room, she followed with adjusted plans. Dad had eaten already. Dad had just fallen asleep. Dad needed a bit of quiet. She said these things with that same soft certainty, a certainty that made me feel like a visitor instead of a son. Mark began showing up more often, usually in the afternoons when the light slanted through the blinds and cast long stripes across the kitchen floor. He carried notebooks and printouts of his landscaping proposals, pages full of ideas he hoped would save his failing business. I watched him sit across from Dad, speaking quickly, pushing numbers and promises across the table. Dad listened with polite confusion, nodding at moments that made no sense. Kelly hovered nearby, making supportive sounds, reinforcing Mark's optimism in subtle ways. I saw how she curved her approval in his direction, how he leaned into it without realizing. When I pulled Mark aside one afternoon, he brushed me off. He said I was making things harder. He said Dad deserved a chance to help. His eyes did not hold anger this time. They held exhaustion, a kind of quiet desperation a man tries to hide but cannot fully bury. He walked away before I could answer. Dad's confusion grew more noticeable. One evening he asked me how long Mom had been gone, even though he had stood beside her hospital bed that final morning. Later that night, he apologized to me for forgetting to pick me up from baseball practice, something that had happened more than 30 years ago. His voice trembled, and I realized he did not know which memories were his own and which had been shaped by someone else's influence. Around dusk each day, when the house settled into its slower rhythm and the lights switched on one by one, I stepped out onto the porch. I sat with my notebook open, organizing evidence beneath the dim glow of the porch light. The wind moved through the siding with a long, low hum. It reminded me of nights when Dad would fix things outside long after dark. I could almost hear his old radio in the distance playing the same country songs he never tired of. The evidence grew in a steady line. ATM withdrawals matched to motel visits, camera clips timed against emails, patterns of money vanishing step by step like footprints disappearing into deeper snow. The more I organized, the more the connections tightened until the truth felt solid enough to hold in my hands. Inside, the pressure grew as quietly as the shifting floorboards beneath my feet. Kelly closed doors without making a sound. She moved Dad from room to room in a slow choreography that left me always a step behind. Some days she left the house during her shifts, returning with grocery bags filled with items Dad did not need. Other times she kept the blinds closed, keeping the rooms dim even when the sun shone bright. She greeted me with a smile each time I arrived, but something in her expression changed. A guardedness, a calculation. I felt it in the way she watched me walk through the house, the way her eyes followed my hands when I picked up a piece of mail or opened the pantry. She had learned my intentions without hearing me speak them. Her confidence grew in the spaces where she believed I could not reach. One evening I found Dad sitting alone in the living room. The television played quietly, a nature documentary with muted colors drifting across the screen. He looked at me and his face lit with recognition, then dimmed as if he were unsure whether the recognition belonged to him. He patted the space beside him. I sat down and he placed his hand lightly on my arm. He asked me if I was all right. His voice carried worry, the kind of worry a father has when he senses something wrong in his son but cannot name it. I told him I was doing fine. He nodded slowly, but his eyes drifted off as if following a memory that moved faster than he could. He asked me what day it was. I told him gently. He nodded again, absorbing it, though his gaze fogged. He turned back to the television and said softly that he hoped he had not made a mistake. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and shifted in his seat. The truth landed deeper then. Someone had been shaping his thoughts, pressing fear into them the way water seeps into wood and changes its weight. I stayed beside him until he drifted into sleep, the blanket rising and falling with each breath. Later that night, I returned to the porch. The wind had grown stronger, rattling a loose gutter. I tightened the timeline in my notebook, matching dates with clips, creating a line that ran straight from Dad's bank to that motel. Each connection felt like a stitch closing a wound, making the picture clearer. My fear shifted into something sharper. I worried not only about losing Dad to manipulation, but also about losing myself. I feared becoming the controlling son, the one who pushed too hard, the one who replaced his father's dignity with suspicion. Yet doing nothing meant letting strangers carve pieces out of the man who had built my childhood with his calloused hands and early morning drives. I watched the porch light throw a pale circle across the yard. The grass moved in the wind, bending in uneven waves. I felt the truth settle inside me, heavy but sure. A confrontation was coming. I could feel it in the way the house breathed, in the way the nights grew quieter, in the way Kelly's eyes flickered when she spotted me writing notes. Something was closing in around all of us, tight and inevitable, a tension stretching like a rope pulled from both ends. I stayed on the porch until the light flickered, until the chill pressed through my jacket, until the night felt like it had settled into my bones. Then I closed the notebook, stood slowly, and walked back inside. The house held its breath around me. The house felt like it was listening. Walls, floor, the old beams above the ceiling, all of it holding a kind of tight silence that settled between each breath I took. I moved slowly through the hallway, past Dad's closed door, past the family photographs that watched me from their frames. I knew I could not keep circling this without stepping into the center of it. The next morning, I drove into town just after sunrise. The streets were half-awake, coffee shops blinking to life, people in heavy coats moving with that quiet purpose weekday mornings always had. Sam's office building sat near the courthouse, the same brick and glass that had watched over 1,000 soul battles most people never heard about. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, then went inside. Sam was already there, tie-loosened reading glasses on. He looked up when I entered, nodded once, and motioned for me to sit. I laid the newest notes and copies on his desk, the paper edges rough from being handled too many times. He scanned them, flipping through the pages like a man putting together a puzzle he had solved before but wished he had not. He said he had spoken with someone he trusted in the state office. Maria Hernandez, a prosecutor who handled elder cases. He said she had seen patterns like this in other towns. When he said her name, his voice carried a note of respect, the kind born from watching someone do the hard things without needing to be thanked. Sam picked up a pen and tapped it lightly on the desk, thinking. He said the evidence pointed toward a coordinated fraud effort. Affidavits from other cases with similar details, caregivers suddenly spending more than they should. Seniors who could not fully explain why their accounts were drained. But he said Maria would need one more piece. Something present tense. A clear line between Kelly and Derek that showed this was not just history, but something still living and moving. He studied me a moment. Then he said that if I wanted to help, I would need to be careful. No heroics, no sudden confrontations that could put Dad in more danger. His gaze held mine steady and clear. He said I knew what kind of man my father was. He asked what kind of man I wanted to be as I stepped into this. I left with the day stretching ahead of me and a plan forming in the quiet spaces between each thought. The sky was a flat, pale gray cloud spread out like thin smoke. I drove back toward Dad's neighborhood, keeping a few car lengths behind Kelly when I saw her hatchback pull away from the house. The traffic was light. Her car moved down familiar streets, then out toward the edge of town. She drove into a nearly empty parking lot behind a closed strip of storefronts. A discount furniture store, a laundromat, an old diner with its windows dark. I parked farther back, just inside the shadow of a bare tree, and watched. The air felt colder here, sharpened by the open space and the wind that came off the highway. A tall man stepped out from around the side of the building. Heavy coat cap, pulled low jeans worn white at the knees. He walked with the casual stride of someone who had been in too many parking lots like this, always on the edges of things. Kelly got out of her car, shoulders drawn in arms close to her sides. She did not move like a partner. She moved like a person bracing for impact. They stood near the back of her car. He handed her a plain envelope. She took it with both hands, her gaze low, and slipped it into her bag. From this distance, I could not hear the words, but I could read the posture. Her head nodded quick and small, as though agreeing before she had a chance to think. He leaned in just a little, the way a man leans in when he wants to remind someone of who is really in control. When she turned away, I caught a glimpse of her face tight in a way I had not seen before. No rehearsed smile, no caregiver warmth. Just a deep, quiet fear pressed into her features. She got into her car and pulled out of the lot faster than necessary, her back straight, hands probably clenched around the wheel. I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots. The man noticed me then. His eyes swept over me once, taking in more than he let on. I closed the distance at a steady pace, stopping a few feet away. We stood there in the empty lot with the wind pushing garbage across the asphalt, two men who understood more about each other than either one wanted to admit. I asked if his name was Derek. He smiled, slow and deliberate. It was the kind of smile a man learns after testing how far intimidation can carry him. His voice when he spoke had that rough edge the motel manager had described. He said my father owed him more than I thought. He said it like the conclusion to an argument I had never been allowed to hear. The words slid between us with a false certainty designed to land deep, to twist doubt into a man who already carried too much guilt. I watched him closely. There was no sign of regret in him, only a kind of calm arrogance settled into his posture. He spoke as if all this had already been decided, as if my role was to accept it. I told him Dad did not owe him anything. My voice came out low but steady. He chuckled under his breath, shrugged lightly, and said some debts did not show up on paper. He was working the angle Sam had warned me about. Make the victim feel responsible. Make the family feel late to their own story. We stood in the chill air, the sky hanging over us like a lid. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind and the distant rush of traffic. I saw the man behind the scheme then. Not just a name in a database, but a living presence making his living off the places where people felt weakest. I thought of Dad at the kitchen table apologizing for things he could not remember. I thought of the way his shoulders curled inward when he asked if he had done something wrong. Derek had taken those old insecurities, the ones built from years on the road and hard choices, and shaped them into a weapon. I did not step closer. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing to be gained in giving this man more of myself. I turned and walked back to the truck, feeling his gaze on my back until I opened the door and closed it. The engine started with a low rumble in the rear-view mirror. I watched him stand there a moment, then disappear around the side of the building. That night back at my place, the world around me felt sharper. I sat at the table with the lamp casting a pool of light across my notes. I thought of Dad's stories about the road, the times he hinted at breakdowns, lost contracts, near misses with money. He had always brushed past the painful parts with a laugh, saying things had a way of working out. Men of his generation did not dwell on their wounds. They folded them into the day and kept driving. Now I saw how those half-told stories had become cracks someone like Derek could slip into. Old guilt was easy to reshape if you knew where to press. You just had to convince a man he was making up for something he failed to do, even if that failure never really happened. I opened my laptop and loaded the footage I had taken in the parking lot. Kelly's posture, the envelope, the tension in her shoulders. Derek's relaxed stance, the way he leaned forward just enough to show her where she stood. I watched it twice, then a third time. By the fourth time, I no longer saw only villains and victims. I saw people caught in the orbit of a man who fed on their fear. Kelly was not innocent. The withdrawals, the forged trust, the quiet control over my father's days. Those choices were hers, but I could no longer see her as the architect. She was operating inside a design Derek had drawn long before she stepped into Dad's house. That realization brought its own weight, a mix of anger and something close to pity. The next day I met Sam in his office again. The light outside was flat and gray, pressing against the windows. I set the flash drive on his desk. He plugged it in without a word and watched the footage, his jaw tightening just enough for me to notice. When it ended, he nodded once, the way a man does when something he suspected is finally confirmed. He said this was what Maria needed, a direct living link between Kelly and the man behind her. He said he would send it that afternoon with his notes and the timeline. His voice carried the steady patience of someone who knew the law moved slower than anger but farther than threats. As I left his office, the hallway lights hummed softly overhead. I paused by the window at the end and looked out at the parking lot below. People moved to their cars, heads down against the mild wind, unaware of the quiet battles being lined up in offices like the one I had just left. I rested my hand against the cool metal of the window frame and let the moment settle. Somewhere in another office, Maria would soon be watching the same footage, studying the same faces. Papers would be signed, requests drafted, steps taken. The day felt suspended, like the air just before a storm finally breaks. The morning held a gray stillness that crept through the windows and settled across the kitchen like a thin film of dust. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, watching the steam fade until nothing rose from it. The night before had left a quiet tremor inside me, a sense that the ground beneath all of us had begun to shift. When the phone rang, the sound cut through the room like a blade. Sam's voice carried its usual steadiness, though a subdued tension lived beneath it. He said Maria was ready to move. She needed Kelly at the office, and she needed her soon. I ended the call and waited a moment, letting the sun settle again before I stood. At Dad's house, Kelly was in the living room sorting towels into careful stacks. The morning light brushed across her face, softening features that had grown sharper in recent days. She lifted her head when she noticed me. For a brief second, her hands froze, and I saw the fear beneath her practiced calm. I told her Sam needed to go over some details with her. I kept my tone even and quiet. She nodded slowly, though her gaze flicked toward the hallway where Dad rested. The drive to Sam's office felt longer than usual. Kelly sat with her hands clasped tight on her lap, fingers interlocked so firmly the knuckles blanched. She stared through the window, not at the passing houses or the gray streets, but somewhere deeper, somewhere she had been hiding from. I watched her breathe slow and shallow, as though each inhale cost her something. When we stepped into the office, Maria stood by the window examining a case file. She had a calm presence, the kind that comes from years of dealing with hard truths and people who run from them. She greeted us with a nod and motioned Kelly to sit. Sam took his seat across from her. His legal pad lay open, pen drawn across it in a smooth line. The air in the room tightened when Maria spoke. Her voice was low and even, giving space for truth to come without force. She laid out what they knew: the accounts, the footage, the motel, the threats implied in the pattern. She spoke each detail quietly, not as accusation but as fact, the kind that left no room for escape. Kelly bowed, her head hair falling forward like a curtain. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Maria waited. Sam waited. The room shifted into a deeper silence. Kelly lifted her face slowly, eyes wet and tired in a way I had not seen before. Then something inside her gave way. Her confession came out in broken phrases. She said Derek had threatened her family. She said he knew where her mother worked, where her brother lived. She said he used that knowledge like a trap, tightening it each time she hesitated. She described nights when he parked outside her house, sending short messages that offered no room for argument. She said she believed he was capable of more than threats. She spoke of the signatures she forged, hands shaking as she described them. She spoke of the envelopes she delivered, the lies she told Dad to keep things quiet. She admitted she had been terrified of Derek long before she moved into my father's life. Now her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of the truth she had carried alone. When she mentioned Mark, her voice broke further. She said Derek saw the desperation in him, the quick hope in his eyes when someone offered help. She said Derek used it to redirect suspicion to make Mark feel supported, useful, chosen. She insisted Mark never knew the full direction of the money, only the promise of saving his business. Her tears came harder then, but she didn't wipe them. She spoke last of Dad. Her words trembled. She said Derek had fed him stories about restitution, about debts tied to an old trucking accident he never fully forgave himself for. She said Derek twisted that guilt like a wire, telling him he could make peace with the past by paying what he supposedly owed. She said she watched his confusion grow and did nothing to stop it, because by then she was trapped in a fear she could not climb out of. The room fell still. Even the hum of the heater sounded distant. I looked at Kelly and saw someone worn down to the bone by choices that spiraled faster than she could manage. She lifted her eyes to mine once. It was not a plea, it was not an apology. It was the look of someone acknowledging the damage she had done and the person she had become in the process. Maria closed her folder gently. She said it was enough. She said a warrant would be prepared. Kelly nodded with her shoulders shaking, pressing her hands together as if holding herself upright. Outside the office, she walked toward her car with slow steps. Just before she opened the door, she turned back toward me. Her voice was faint when she spoke. She asked if Dad ever talked about being scared. I told her he had, though not in the way she meant. She nodded once, a sad and hollow motion, then got into her car and drove away. That evening, Sam called again. His words were short but clear. The warrant had been signed. Officers were on their way to the motel. A while later, he called once more. They had found Derek. He tried to run. He did not get far. They found his phone, his notes, the names of seniors from counties all around ours. It was bigger than any of us had seen at first. I drove to Dad's house after sunset. The lights glowed softly through the windows, casting warm shapes onto the snow. Inside, Mark sat on the couch, shoulders hunched, elbows on his knees. His face was pale and drawn, stripped of the pride that usually hardened his features. He looked up at me but could not hold my gaze. He said he never meant to be part of anything that hurt Dad. His voice cracked a sharp sound in the quiet room. He stared at his hands as if trying to understand how they had led him here. I stood beside him for a moment, then sat next to him. He tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. I placed a hand on his back, light and brief, more gesture than comfort. But it was all I could offer. Laura hovered nearby with her hands clasped, silent but steady. She looked at Mark with a heartbreak only a sister knows. She looked at me with quiet plea in her eyes, asking without words for patience, for understanding, for something that could hold us together. Dad sat in the dining room with a blanket wrapped around him. His face softened when he saw me. He lifted his hand slightly, the way he did when he was unsure what to say. I pulled a chair close. He asked what had happened. His voice trembled with confusion. I answered carefully, sparing him the worst of it. He listened, eyes glistening, then lowered his head. He whispered that he did not understand how he had believed strangers over his own children. His grief came out in one quiet tear that slid down his cheek. I wiped it gently with my thumb, the way he once did for me when I was young and scared. The house felt heavier than it had in weeks, but there was a different kind of quiet now, a quiet that followed truth. A quiet that revealed what had grown in the shadows between us. Guilt distanced the mistakes we refused to see. When I stood, the room held its breath. Mark looked up at me with eyes rimmed red. Dad watched me with a mix of love and loss that settled deep in my chest. Laura moved closer, her presence grounding the room. Outside, the porch light flickered once before finding its glow again. It cast a soft pool of light across the steps as if the house itself was trying to guide us forward, even if none of us knew quite where the next step would lead. The air outside held a calm I had not felt in months. A soft coolness that drifted across the yard as I walked down the steps and let the night settle around me. There was no rush left in me. No weight pressing against my ribs, only a slow unwinding that took its time. In the days that followed, that quiet stayed close, lingering like something earned. Spring arrived gently. The snow melted into thin streams along the sidewalks, and the mornings grew softer. When the court dates finally came, I sat in a bench near the back of the room, watching the slow machinery of justice move forward with careful precision. When Derek was convicted, Maria walked over and sat beside me for a moment. She rested her hands on her knees and said it was a solid verdict, the kind that held. Still, her eyes carried the heaviness that comes from knowing justice never returns everything it takes. Kelly's hearing was different. She stood before the judge with her shoulders drawn and her voice small but steady as she accepted probation therapy and restitution. The ruling felt right, not lenient, but human. When she left the courtroom, she paused as she passed me. Her gaze lifted for a heartbeat. There was no anger in it, no plea, only a tired recognition of what she had done and what she still had to face. Then she walked down the hallway and disappeared into the afternoon light. Life slowly found its rhythm again. I returned to Dad's house in the early mornings before work, brewing coffee in the old kitchen, while he shuffled in from the hallway. Some days he remembered details clearly, small things like the road he used to take on long hauls or the diner in Kentucky that served the best pie. Other days he wandered in circles, sorting through pieces of memory he could not quite place. But he smiled more often now, and sometimes he touched the kitchen counter and said it felt familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. One afternoon he pointed at Mom's old ceramic bowl on the shelf, the one with the chipped rim. He rested his fingers on it and whispered her name. It was the first time he had said it in weeks. His voice wavered but held a kind of clarity I had not seen in a long time. I stood beside him a moment longer than I needed to, letting the silence stretch in a way that felt warm rather than heavy. A few evenings later, we gathered again at the old kitchen table. The wood carried the marks of our childhood, faint scratches from school projects, and the worn soot where Mom's elbows used to rest. The room felt fuller than it had in months. Mark spoke first. His apology came out uneven, as though each word cost him something real. He admitted he had been blind, desperate, too willing to believe someone who fed him what he wanted to hear. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them new. There was no defensiveness, only the rawness of a man who finally recognized his own mistakes. I told him we still had time to fix things. The words came naturally, and I meant every one of them. He nodded, not in relief, but in understanding. Laura sat beside us with her arms folded gently. She reached out and squeezed Mark's shoulder, then gave me a small, quiet smile. It was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had held the family together without saying much. Someone who carried more than she ever admitted. In that moment, I realized how much she had steadied us all. As the sun dipped behind the houses that evening, Dad stepped onto the porch with us. He moved slowly but with purpose. He reached for my hand and held it between his palms. His grip was soft but sure. He said he was glad I stayed, glad I fought for him when he could not fight for himself. His voice thinned with emotion, yet there was a steadiness beneath it that came from deep inside the part of him untouched by fear or confusion. He looked at Mark next, and something quiet passed between them, an unspoken forgiveness or maybe an understanding that neither needed to name. Then he looked at Laura and told her she reminded him of her mother. Laura covered her face with one hand, laughing softly even as her eyes filled. Later, I walked down the porch steps and stood in the yard. The sky had settled into a deep amber haze, fading slowly into blue. The house behind me glowed with warm light from the windows, each room carrying the echo of everything we had endured. A faint breeze moved through the maple tree by the driveway, rustling the branches in a sick rhythm that loosened the last knot inside me. I knew then that revenge had never been the heart of this journey. What carried me through was something quieter, a need to bring back the truth, to protect the dignity of a man whose life had weathered enough storms already. Justice had its place, but what remained afterward was the slow, patient repair of a family that had nearly broken in the dark. A few days later, Dad and I sat on the porch again. He held a mug of tea, tracing the rim absently as he watched the road. He asked how everything ended. I gave him the simplest version, the one his heart could hold without confusion. He nodded and patted my arm. He said kindness lasts longer than fear. His words settled inside me, still and steady. The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of fresh grass across the yard. The porch light flickered once, just enough to catch my eye before settling into a warm and unwavering glow. I leaned back in my chair and let the quiet gather around us, letting it stay without reaching for anything more.